The Spinoff Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa.
No mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest this week is Danyl Mclauchlan, who has been writing for the Spinoff since our very early days. I think maybe even his first piece would have been in 2014. I had been reading him for some years prior to that. He ran this blog called The Dim Post, where he would write about politics both in a kind of sort of short take analytical sense, but also in a satirical way. And it was back in the day when you would just go and look at a collection of blogs and just update them to see if there was something new that day, which I think a number of people are intensely nostalgic toward that era of the internet now. But from there, I'd become quite obsessed with his brain, and so it was a real delight when he agreed to start writing for the Spinoff, and he's continued to do that over the years since. Often writes sort of long reviews or even essays, as well as the occasional pieces of sort of fast take political analysis. And he's connected to politics, has friends there, has been involved with the Green Party. But what I like most about his writing is he has just an incredibly open mind. It doesn't, seeks to understand why things are the way they are, and assumes, tries to understand phenomena, even or positions, even those that he doesn't himself hold, assuming good faith at least the origins, and that's what makes his work feels quite different from the current mode. And he's not for everyone for that reason, but I always come away with feeling like my mind's stretched. He's historically, he's been a novelist, and as you'll hear in the discussion, he still is, but he also wrote a collection of essays, which was published on VUP earlier this year, called Tranquility and Ruin, 3 long essays. We discussed one of them at length, which is about his engaging with the world of effective altruism, and I think that is some kind of a masterpiece, and we discussed that at length. We also discuss a recent essay he wrote for the Spinoff about the concept of postjournalism, and which I'm not sure I buy, but I think is a useful way of understanding things. It's this idea that when we move from a model of advertiser-funded to reader or audience-funded journalism, something fundamentally changes about the motives of the product and therefore the product itself. And finally, we talk about Simon Bridges, whose book National Identity Danyl was due to be part of the launch of in Wellington, and who's he's interviewed more than once. And I think I'm sort of 2/3 of the way through his book, and I find it very interesting. I find Simon Bridges a very interesting character, and in almost the same way that Danyl is in some respects, and that post his liberating from the national leadership, that he has become this quite unorthodox figure, breaks many of the rules of contemporary politics. It's not at all clear whether that has given him any dividends, in the sense that the people who now like him more seem to be more on the left, in a place which they would never vote for him, but he certainly seems more content. So we talk about that a bit as well. This is Danyl Mclauchlan on The Fold. Kia ora, Danyl, and welcome to a special lockdown edition of The Fold.
Howdy, Duncan.
I've been wanting to have you on The Fold for a long while. I hope you don't mind me telling the listeners, one of my favourite writers in the country. But what spurred it was a
do people ever complain when you say that? I hope you don't mind me telling the listeners.
Some people are self-conscious about it, you know.
Okay.
I actually imagined you might be one of those people, right. But I'm glad to hear that you don't mind being publicly praised.
No, you put it all out there.
So the reason I'm having you on is that you wrote a piece for us over the weekend, which is a book review that kind of expanded into a bit of an essay or a summary of the thesis about the idea that journalism, whatever we have considered to be journalism historically, is dead or dying, and we're now moving into something which is qualitatively different, and should and that they were kind of putting under the umbrella of post-journalism. One of the things I love most about your writing is that you can very lucidly open up these sort of frontiers without quite tipping your hand in terms of how you're responding to them. I mean, obviously you're interested in them enough to write 3,000 words, but I wondered if you don't mind me kind of giving me a sense of how you responded to it, whether you buy the thesis in whole or in part.
I don't know. The thing about that book is it's very dense and it's very fascinating. And it's one of those books where I kind of felt like the fun and most interesting way to write about it was just to really kind of buy into the worldview of the author and communicate it in the review. And so, because I'm actually quite kind of persuadable, or maybe gullible is the word. When I'm reading a book, I'm quite often just completely persuaded by what the author is saying, and then it's only after I've had time to let it compost around in my mind for a little while that I start to think about it a little bit. But I mean, his thesis is that with the sort of obsolescence of newspapers, the fact that they're kind of a dying technology in terms of media, that they've got about 10 years left, he estimates, before it's just no longer profitable to own printing presses and distribute media in this format. And so after that, we're really totally into the transition to digital media. It's a transition we're already quite a long way through, and that the economic incentives of digital media turn out to be really, really different from the economic incentives of newspaper. When you were distributing a newspaper, most of your revenue came from advertising, and so the incentive was to just get the newspaper out to as many people as possible. Like when I was a teenager, I had a job as a newspaper delivery boy, which is a job that no longer exists. And most newspaper companies actually lost money paying teenagers to deliver the news to their readers. The subscription didn't really cover that, but the advertising revenue from having such a large base of readers made up for that. It was hugely profitable. And that kind of dictated a certain type of media model. And you wanted it incentivized the objective model of news, the kind of both sides journalism, and journalism that was impartial and objective, and that readers could really trust because you wanted as many people reading it as possible. And Mir's argument, the guy who wrote this book, is this Russian media theorist who lectures in Canada, is that digital media, the incentives are completely different. That what most media companies have found is that people won't really pay for the news as it existed in that kind of objective format because they can get it for free anywhere. What they will pay for is to become a member of a media organization that they see as kind of taking a sort of political or ideological or activist stance on issues that they care about. And so they'll pay to, proliferate ideological arguments or activist causes that they care about. So that's his argument. And I think in a way, it's obviously true once you kind of see that and just look at what news organizations are doing. That is the model that is successful. And so in that sense, I kind of accept it. I do think one thing he kind of misses a little bit is that lots of journalists, I think, still do just kind of want to be journalists, and they have lots of journalists, at least good journalists, have this kind of contrarian streak in them, and they don't want to be just doing what the economic logic of the industry dictates, and that kind of does give it always a little bit of a kind of backbone there. What's your perspective on this?
I mean, I certainly see that those phenomena are, rattling round, and obviously to declare an enormous conflict, the Spinoff is a member-funded organisation. That's the largest part of our revenue stream is readers paying for our work. So, the sort of rational thing to do as the person running that enterprise is to listen hard to those readers, what they tell you, but also what they do and what that tells you, and to respond to that. But and that is fundamentally very different from the former model, which, as you say, was basically almost entirely funded, or the gravity of it was driven by advertisers. And we are largely talking about print media, but print media has been the largest employer of journalists and has kind of, for the most part, set the agenda. I think that's there might be some other forms of journalists who would bristle at that, but just by virtue of having more journalists than any other part, I think that has broadly been true. I guess the parts that there's two things that I struggle with in terms of, one is, as you touched on, I think there is an attachment to, or there is a contrarianism and the journalist community is quite hard to move en masse in any particular direction. In fact, when it starts to be conscious of any kind of pressure on it, it tends to go elsewhere. And I think that any sense that there is as someone running an editorial organization, you can do that through your hiring, you can do that through sub-editors and so on. And that's, but actually telling people what to write, especially in an era where opinion is more sort of common than maybe has been in prior areas, and you touched on that in the piece. It's pretty difficult to do. I guess that the main critique I have of it is a couple of years ago I read David Halberstam's The Powers That Be, which is have you read that?
No, I've only read Best and the Brightest by him, which is a great book.
Yeah, he's got quite a few great books. He wrote a brilliant. He's written really great books on basketball, which is how I first got into him. About the '70s Trailblazers and Michael Jordan and so on. But this book is about it sort of covers the history of 20th century media up to, I think, the 70s, and does that through these sort of long, very close studies of the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time magazine, and CBS, I think. But what emerges from that is that, this has always been, or certainly historically, was a horrifically compromised industry. And the idea of, journalism has always presented itself as objective, but I don't think at many points it has been on the, in any kind of a grand scale. No. There are these amazing passages about Henry Luce, who was the
Life magazine,
Life and Time. He owned those properties, and they had the best journalists in the world in Vietnam, who would consistently file these extraordinary dispatches about the horrors and just how badly it was going wrong. And they had this very powerful editor and then even more powerful publisher who were just like, we don't want that story told. And so it just wouldn't make it in to print. And, and before that, the Chandlers who owned the LA Times and basically bought it so that they could override the public, just bully politicians into allowing them to build canals to get water to build out LA, and would just routinely evict politicians from power who got in their way. So, and these are two of, Time and the LA Times, two of the probably 10 or 20 most august publications in the public mind.
Yeah, that is a point that he's really making in this book, is that he's not talking about like a golden age where journalism was objective and true, and now we're in the sort of, like, I don't know, rust age when journalism is fake news and post-journalism and that it can't be trusted. He just thinks that the transition between the medium is so radical and it's happening before our eyes that it kind of needs a new term to help us pay attention to it. Like, one thing I kept thinking when I was reading the book is that you couldn't really have Me Too stories in the sort of golden age of journalism, just because they're stories that, make some readers really, really angry and they cancel their subscriptions. And if your business model relies on just having as many subscribers as possible so you can sell your attention to advertisers, that's just kind of a form of journalism. You just can't really do that. Whereas you can do that in the digital age because you're going to have members who, because it is a form of activism, and you're going to have members who really believe in that form of activism. And so, that's still, you can still have a credible business there. But
I think I actually think that's a really good kind of example of ways that journalism has been changed in recent years, and that but that also I think that maybe that's a slight misreading, and that you even when you have a digital, like a member or a subscriber model, and that's a large part of your income, and even the Herald, like NZME's half year performance came out today, and they're up to 27% of their revenue is subscriber based, which is from near zero functionally a few years ago, which is kind of extraordinary. But that when you do that, you still have an interest in growth. So there is that balancing act between appeasing your base, people who are currently subscribed, and also wanting to broaden the tent to get more in. And the New York Times is as Ben Smith has written, is trying to become the Netflix of journalism in some respects, and there you can feel the tension there in between, like the your sort of low hanging fruit subscribers are all there, and you've got to keep them happy, but also you can't just serve them, otherwise you're sort of unpaused and effectively vulnerable in terms of growth. And I guess the other kind of interesting, just sort of continuing that Me Too thought, is that if you see the sort of stories, the sort of places that Me Too stories get written about, they tend to be media companies, universities, political parties, law firms. It's quite a specific type of place that is the intense focus of a lot of kind of membership-driven coverage, that kind of, like, I don't know, urban liberal elite or whatever you want to call it. And so it's still not like, you can't really say it's like objective journalism that's happening now that couldn't happen before, because you're still constrained by the things that your subscriber base is interested in. Yeah, I mean, it could be that it's your subscriber base being interested, and it's also the kind of stories that get brought to you. I think there is a large chunk of the population that is only a grazing consumer of news, and certainly wouldn't consume in-depth investigations in any form. And while they are surrounded by, probably, as bad, if not worse, examples of Me Too type phenomena, they don't naturally bring it to the attention of the journalistic community. And as the journalistic community has increasingly become a professional class, as opposed to, the sort of straight from school, go into an apprenticeship. It was almost more of a trade. Historically, I think it probably has got some distance from connections to those kind of communities at times.
That's something I was thinking about when I was reading this book. My wife used to work for the New Zealand Press Association, which was the New Zealand wire service that got shut down, I think, about 10 years ago. And lots of the journalists in there, like it was kind of predominantly white. The older journalists were almost all men. But there was a much larger class diversity, which I think you just don't really have at all in contemporary newsrooms, which was lots of the journalists started out as sports journalists or racing journalists on a provincial newspaper, and they didn't have degrees. And so you kind of had a diversity of life experience there. Sort of, what do they call, like perspective diversity or something, which I think you kind of lose once you get the professionalization of the industry.
Yeah, I think that's probably true on some level, but I do think that the fact that contemporary journalism is animated by a concern to represent a greater, diversity, particularly sort of an ethnic diversity of what has previously been a largely Pākehā world, particularly in the mainstream media, means that it kind of has naturally broadened the church in some respects, even as, it might, the sort of style and paths into it might have changed. So, I mean, that's why I guess the thing I've struggled with is that it implicitly says that there was a particular era of journalism that is ending and moving into the next. And I'm not certain that journalism hasn't always been in motion, and that as we move into this new era, that the change to the economic model is not so radical a thing as to deserve a new name. But undeniably, I think it has a lot of it has wrought a lot of change to how it is made and who it is for, and not always for the better.
I guess also he's predominantly talking about the US and the UK media, and we haven't kind of had the subtitle of the book is How Trump Saved the Media or something, because his hypothesis is that Trump turned out to be just the ideal subject for post-journalism, and that he was the kind of existential enemy to the class of people within society who were just most likely to become subscribers to, existing media stations and existing media channels. And so we haven't really had a sort of, an event, or Brexit in the UK, we haven't had an event like that in New Zealand. And so it'll be interesting to see if we do see something like that, if there's a change of government in New Zealand and we get, a national government or a national act government, that kind of creates the real opportunity for that post-journalism model that we're talking about, and that you can kind of say, oh, well, our country is just under threat, and funding the media is the only way you can kind of defend yourself against that threat. So, yeah, if we see, I guess we'll be able to demonstrate whether or not his hypothesis is correct if we have something like that, which creates that business opportunity.
I think that's why New Zealand is such an intriguing outlier in a global media sense, particularly in the sort of Anglosphere or the English-speaking world, in that we don't really, and this is going to kind of irk some listeners potentially, but we don't really have a right-wing media here. We have obviously ZB and Mike Hosking, who's like a one-man army in many respects, but we have a very moderate media sort of sector by global standards. And I think one of the big things, I mean, you look at the UK, Australia, and the US, that three of the countries to which we have the strongest ties and kind of consume the most media from, all of them have big Murdoch presences. And the Murdoch media is actually one area of them all which has probably the most top-down editorial control, which is why it's so shocking when something like the Arizona being called for Biden, first by Fox, when there are kind of jarring breaks from that. But Murdoch hasn't been here for 15 years, and both in terms of the proprietors, the editors, people complain about the Herald, and I think there are things you can complain about with all of our organisations, Spinoff included, but we don't really have a highly partisan media, and therefore, which I think is both reflective of and informs our political culture and the relationship between politics and media. And sometimes you kind of see Twitter attempting to almost replicate the posture of, overseas sort of left-right tribal dynamics without really the material. Is that something that you sort of, notice yourself?
I think so. There's that replicating, especially US politics in New Zealand, is something that I kind of think is an underrated problem in New Zealand politics, and the same goes for the UK, less so Australia, in that the UK and America are politically very unhappy, dysfunctional countries. And it seems like quite misguided to kind of look at them, but because they're so culturally dominant, I guess it's kind of a natural thing to do and say, well, let's just kind of like live out all of the things that are happening in these, like states that almost seem to be disintegrating. Let's just do all that in New Zealand, even though there's no real kind of, native local argument for any of these things going on. So when people are, like reproducing the kind of anti-lockdown protests and anti-mask protests, using all the, rhetoric of the US right, or when people on the left are protesting like the appointment of conservatives to the Supreme Court in the US, it seems, I'm just trying to struggle the word to it. Something strange about kind of recreating their politics here for no other reason than we're kind of seeing it happening on social media, and we're just sort of acting it out almost compulsively. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I guess there is a sense that, for us to, I mean, that's one of the things about the sort of social media, digital media era, is that you have instant access to the best or the most of what's being created and discussed anywhere in the world at all times. There's we tend to group around following specific things, and honestly, the quality from both the UX, the writing, the just how fascinating the sort of psychodramas are. Like, why wouldn't you follow these things? I mean, you've written, I think, persuasively about why we shouldn't, but I get the feeling that you probably still do follow US politics quite closely, just as I do. But like, is it useful for us, for particularly our political media classes to understand our politics through a similar framing mechanism? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've read the no one is talking about this, the Patricia Lockwood book, which is basically about Twitter and about how addictive it is. But one of the things she really points out and makes fun of in the book is how homogenizing it is. Everybody ends up making the exact same jokes and saying the exact same things, while kind of also, the title of the book is No One Else Is Talking About This. And often people will just be all saying the same thing while saying, why isn't anyone talking about this? And it's this kind of, bizarre, underrated phenomenon of the way that especially the media and intellectual class get homogenized by being addicted to digital media.
Yeah, I think it's a phenomena that feels very much that it has arisen in recent years. I tend to, for the same reasons that I think that journalism has a natural resistance to going too far in any particular direction, because of that contrarian streak, I just hope that most of these things will work themselves out over time, because it just gets really boring. One thing, just to switch tack slightly, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, because I feel like you have that streak in you as well, perhaps faster or more pronounced potentially, but this idea that whenever there is a dominant way of understanding a particular view or part of society, that you tend to, rather than go along with that view, you tend to kind of want to scrutinize what it's built on, go back to the origins. And I think the apotheosis of that was your essay that we published under the title Communism by Stealth in 2017, which was basically about the origins of conservatism and how it interlocked with progressivism in the 20th century, and then how neoliberalism or the kind of belief, the veneration in the power of the market kind of fused with a flaw in conservatism. It's a really stunning piece of writing, which I encourage our listeners to read if they haven't already. But what I really admired about it was that it basically, like, we sit in, broadly speaking, in these camps. I don't think we make too many super good faith efforts to understand why we are where we are, and often it basically is as much as anything traceable to our parenting. But you kind of wanted to look into that, and the more you looked, the more you saw there was useful things in both origin stories and kind of deep abiding flaws. Where did that essay come from? And just tell me about the thesis of it a bit more.
So, But it just came from kind of reading a few books and thinking about the contents, really. I think there are about 5 books that I reference in there, and one is Moneyball, which is the Michael Lewis book, which is them figuring out how to do statistical analysis on baseball. Another is a really great science fiction novel called Rent Plenty by Francis Buford, in which he looks at the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s when Stalin is gone and they're kind of industrializing and communism really seems to be working. It seems to be doing everything that it was supposed to do on the box, and then it just kind of collapses. And so he has this really deep dive into what went wrong with the Soviet economy. And it's about a James Scott book called Seeing Like a State, which, I mean, James Scott describes himself as an anarchist, but it's the best, most persuasive argument for the kind of original concept of neoliberalism that I've read, the idea that the belief in the wisdom of crowds, essentially, and also just sort of in local knowledge that people know best about their own local lives and can make decisions for themselves instead of having their decisions made by kind of the state or rational planners. So I kind of read those books and had been thinking about them for a while, and I just sort of wrote that, and the pretext was that because that it had to be sort of vaguely topical in some way. And the pretext was that we were going into the election and National were talking about their social investment idea, but they'd actually stopped talking about it by the time I'd written the essay and gotten it published because they decided it was too complicated to communicate in an election environment. And so, it kind of looks at the way that there are these sort of deep problems with organizing complex economies. And those are one of the things that drives us into dividing into being left-wing or being right-wing or believing in the power of the state or the power of the market is that we're kind of trying to solve these very, very deep problems with how to organize complex societies. And reading it, because I read through it again this morning because you said you wanted to talk about it, I kind of, the one thing I'd modify that is that I think a lot of our politics actually kind of comes from our temperaments. Like, I think conservative people are disposed towards being conservative. I think they sort of have a kind of a fear of change, and they're comforted by the familiar. And I think people who are really left-wing or really progressive are just more have kind of a positive emotional reaction to the idea of change or the idea of new ideas. And I think those sort of like psychological drives determine a lot more of our politics than often people who are, political scientists think that they do.
I tend to agree, and I wonder how much of that is, this is, you can get very basic on this. Like, the cliche is that you are a progressive when you're younger and conservative when you're older, and some of that is, having more to lose, sort of more life experience, having a nostalgic attachment to the world that you grew up in, which is changing around you. But I also wonder if on some level it's like a biological imperative, and that if you have like a roughly, some kind of rough balance between those two competitive forces, which is often what I felt like, while New Zealand is necessarily imperfect, the default caveat where I would take our hand over almost any other countries is because we have over the last 30 years or so sort of inched back and forth rather than having these wild jags. And I think it's largely served us better than the counterfactual of what's happened in other countries. There definitely feels like there's something that is kind of innate in there. I agree.
I started writing a piece about this earlier this year, but it just kind of got abandoned because there was so much else going on. But it was about how this idea of seeing politics and political beliefs as more of an ecosystem, and you have the left often trying to change things. The left isn't always trying to change things, like in terms of like the environment. The left is actually quite conservative and the right is quite radical, I think. And it kind of reminds us that these groups are often quite arbitrary and contingent. But in any way, so this idea that, what you just said, it is good to have a balance between them. And I started writing it because there were a couple of scandals about this kind of 20th century progressive icons. One was Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood in the US, and really drove this idea that women should have access to reproductive medicine and that it should be free for low-income women. And so for a long time, she was seen as one of the most, inspiring and admired progressive activists in the 20th century. But they took her name off the Sanger building in New York recently because Sanger was an advocate for eugenics, the idea that you should also have like a medical intervention in the population to kind of stop the wrong sort of people from having children, because this was actually an idea that was incredibly widespread among the left during the early 20th century, and The Guardian endorsed eugenics, and all these other really important left-wing thinkers endorsed eugenics. And at the time, it was conservatives that were kind of opposing this and saying, no, you're kind of interfering in God's plan and that kind of thing. And so, like, my point in all this is that the left often has quite terrible ideas, and they kind of tend to get not only just forgotten, but reviled when the ideas turn out to, do get revealed to be terrible. So there is like real value in having conservatives around saying, hey, no, your plan to make society a better place actually sounds really terrible and could have all these horrible unintended consequences. And so we're going to push back against it. And I think it's healthy to see it as a kind of ecosystem in which you have people coming up with ideas, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And the way we find that out is that you have conservatives pushing back against it, and you have centrists kind of like trying to figure out which of them might fly and which of them won't. Does that sound like a plausible political ideology to you?
Yeah, not like a deeply unpopular one, but one that certainly seems plausible to me. It's vaguely related in some respects, at least in terms of the, broadly nestling under the it's more complicated than you think umbrella, than to the central essay to Tranquility and Ruin, which is your book that came out earlier this year, which again I urge our listeners to buy. It's a collection of 3 essays. The one I want to talk about is on the effective altruist, which you went along to a camp to kind of chew on with them in person, while also introducing some of the debates and the progression of the idea. Do you want to just tell me about the effective altruists and how you got drawn to them to the extent that you would make them essentially the centerpiece of that book?
Yeah, so the effective altruists are kind of like activist nerds is one term I use to describe them. I don't know how comfortable they'd be with that. But the idea traces back to an argument that Peter Singer made in this, who's a moral philosopher, in this very famous essay about you come across a child on the road and they're drowning, and do you save the child even though you ruin your clothes? And everybody says yes, but Singer's argument is actually you don't, because we live in a world in which it's reasonably easy to make donations to charities operating in the third world who are literally saving children from dying of malaria or intestinal parasites or other easily preventable diseases. And so, but most people in the West just choose not to donate to those charities. And so Singer's argument is that we should kind of radically consider what is and isn't moral in the world that we live in today, in which we have these massive inegalitarian conditions. And so the effective altruists are a group of people that really go down the rabbit hole and trying to figure out how to live more moral lives based on the premises of Singer's argument that you're kind of like, if you're a person born into a wealthy country, especially if you're sort of born into the middle class, the upper middle class, and you could potentially be earning quite a lot of money, you have this obligation to be helping people or reducing suffering in the world. And so I really got drawn to the idea because I don't know, I'd been involved with the Green Party for a couple of years, and one of the things that kind of frustrated me about that was that it often seemed like there was no discussion about what is the data that we're operating on here, and what's the evidence for what we're doing, and what are the outcomes. That was often just a conversation that never happened, and you could never really ask those questions, it felt like. And so the effective altruists were kind of like started from there. How do we know that we're actually accomplishing anything is like the very first question that they ask. So that was incredibly attractive to me.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Like I said earlier, you have this ability to, both in a very fascinated way, explain the motives or what drives or a different way of thinking about these various kind of issues and policies and so on, without ever quite tipping your hat. I mean, you know, like, whereas this one, the level of fascination felt like you were almost becoming it without ever explicitly saying that by the end to me.
Yeah. So they do, if you're an effective altruist, you are meant to give at least 10% of your income to effective charities. And I don't give that much, but I do donate to, I do donate to the effective charities. I'm just really persuaded by that part of the argument. Lots of the other stuff, because a big part of their kind of ideology is that you sort of have to follow the logic where it goes. And so even if it sounds a bit strange, and that's tied into this idea that often ideas that sound strange at first can be really transformational because nobody else is kind of doing it, nobody else has thought of it, and so they're quite committed to listening to odd and unusual ideas because that might be what the next really, really big thing is. And so you end up, like, one of their ideas is about wild animal suffering, that there is just a lot of suffering in the natural world. Like, most of the animals that are kind of born into it end up dying by being eaten by another animal. And so the amount of suffering that's going on in that, just in the environment, is vast, and maybe humans should be doing something about that. Sounds like a very, very unlikely, weird idea to me, but the effective altruists, just because of the kind of principles the organization is founded on, sort of have to accept that that is something that they should be thinking about more. So, so I'm attracted by the idea that they are interested in logic and reason and data, but also, a lot of it just is quite weird and quite unlikely. But it's fun to be hearing new and weird, unlikely ideas instead of, the kind of sort of environment where, like in the Patricia Lockwood book, where everyone is just saying the same things over and over again and kind of pretending that it's radical and new and different when it's just intensely conformist and boring.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the arguments that I thought was fascinating and kind of struck me as in that realm of like an idea that's bizarre on the face of it, but actually has a lot. The more you look, the more you sort of buy it, is this X-risk idea, which strikes me as kind of analogous to climate change in some respects, in that when it first was started to be discussed, it was remote, it was not particularly well understood. It sort of seemed fantastical in a way. The idea that human activity could influence the weather, and we're talking about in the 70s, 80s here, and now it's we're living in that climate. X-risk is this idea. Correct me if I'm wrong. That the advances in AI and machine learning and so on will raise the real possibility that sometime in the future we could be sort of destroyed by the advanced machines and the machine learning that we're creating, and therefore we should start to think about how we obstruct or counterbalance that now.
Yeah, so this is something that's controversial within effective altruism. So the idea of X risk, existential risk, is that if you value human life, then you kind of have to ask questions like, well, where are the most human lives? And one of the answers that is philosophically credible is, well, they're mostly in the future, like, possibly that our species could have many, many trillions of lives in the future. And so we should put a value on them. And that means that anything that kind of threatens those lives really should be taken extremely seriously. Like, if you're sort of balancing lives, which is more important, the 7 billion lives today or the trillions of lives in the future, and sometimes the number 64 quadrillion gets thrown around. Well, obviously it's the ones in the future, so we should be doing everything to kind of protect the existence of those lives. And so, like, nuclear war is obviously a potential X risk. The planet getting hit by a meteor is a potential X risk. But the ones that lots of effective altruists end up getting interested in is strong AI. So, like greater than human intelligence or human intelligence at scale could potentially be something that wipes out the species almost accidentally. Like there's the saying that they have in that community, which is that the AI, when it exists, if it gets built, doesn't hate you, but it also doesn't love you. You just are made of atoms that it might want to use for something else. And so I think that communicates the way that the AI's interests and alignments won't be sort of like the existence of human lives will have no kind of positive value for it. It won't hate us. It won't have any feelings for us, but it might just want to exterminate us because that's like a peripheral goal on the way to doing something that it might want to do. And so that's an X risk that some of the effective altruists think is really important and should be the organization's top priority. But other effective altruists say, well, no, that's weird, and we don't really kind of buy into that logic, and we're far more interested in animal suffering and global poverty. Global poverty is still the thing that the organization is most interested in.
I think that that's kind of why it's such a compelling subject, in that the arguments can be both visceral and very heady at the same time, but they all do seem to come from a very well-motivated and intentioned place. Just to move on a bit, I became familiar with your work through reading the Dim Post, which was a blog that you had in the sort of early to mid-2010s, maybe before. Certainly that's when I became aware of it. It was very short form in contrast to the sort of epic essays that you commonly publish now. At the time, I think if in terms of your creative output, your written output, you would typically be described as a novelist, as a satirist, and a satirist, and you don't seem to write novels anymore, and only very seldom satire. What happened?
I don't know. I kind of write satire every now and then, and it just doesn't seem that funny to me. And so, when I occasionally go back and look at that old stuff, some of it is, it's kind of funny and is just of a quality that I can't really recreate anymore. So I just can't write that stuff anymore. So I write other stuff. The novels, I would still very much like to be writing novels, but it's the most time-consuming form of writing I've found. I just have to redraft, and it takes years and years and years to produce a novel that I'm kind of happy with. So, I've got some really good ideas for novels that I want to write, and it's just a matter of trying to find the time to write them. So, that's the shift, I think. But also, I think a lot of the interesting writing at the moment is non-fiction. Essays. A lot of the best books that I've read over the last 10 years have been essayistic or non-fiction, like book-length journalism. I kind of want to put in a pitch for the idea of the book, and that it's a form of media that is really upfront in terms of the transaction. Like, you're paying some money for the book, and then once you've paid it, the author is not trying to scam you in any way anymore. You've kind of, completed the transaction with them. Whereas with, like lots of digital media, there's often kind of an agenda going on where your attention is being monetized to a tech platform or something else. So it kind of seems free, but it isn't. Whereas the book is just a fairly honest transaction.
No, I buy that. One person who has recently taken the time to write a book is Simon Bridges, who has written a book called National Identity, which is not underlined, a political memoir, and it's a very funny cover, which features him with his chin resting on a fist.
Yeah.
He's a character that I think we both find more interesting, and who's become, subsequent to his rolling as leader a bit over a year ago, I think probably of more texture and more interest than he maybe had while he was in his, what you might call his political prime.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've interviewed him for Politics and Pubs, which I want to talk about in a second, but you were also going to be part of the launch of his book, which is an odd thing for someone, you know, because he is the very definition of a conservative, and I think that's what he discusses in the book. And you're a person who was involved in the Green Party until relatively recently. What's the attraction there?
I don't know. Like, he's just like lots of people that came to that Politics and Pubs event that we did in Wellington, I think in 2020. You know, they were the kind of people, it was organised by Verb Wellington, which is kind of a literary events organisation. And most of the people were the people that would go along to a literary event in Wellington. They're very left-wing, and almost everybody walked out liking Simon Bridges. And what's interesting about that is that he really didn't try to pander to the crowd at all. He doesn't try to pretend that he's not a conservative politician. And so it's just kind of a fascinating phenomenon in that, I don't think any of them would be voting for him, and I probably wouldn't vote National if Simon was leaving it. But yeah, there is just something that he kind of he has an interesting background, an interesting perspective. He's quite funny, and when he's trying to seem authentic, he seems very interesting, I think, and connects with people in a way that he didn't when he was playing a sort of generic conservative politician.
I mean, what do you say there about playing a conservative politician? I think that the reveal of his sort of true character has been far more interesting than the one that he held as leader is a big part of what's made him compelling, you know. And I thought his candor, you know, at that Politics and Pubs event where he talked about, for example, like just how incredibly important it is to get on the 6 o'clock news.
Yeah.
And you basically have to just oppose in the strongest possible language whatever the government says it's doing that day, and that's just your lot. I think for a lot of people, even, you know, those who are sort of hyper engaged with the process like us, to sort of really think about what is involved in being the leader of the opposition, that was kind of revelatory, and I think that he's continued that on into National Identity, where he talks about, you know, the sort of struggle with being a Māori man and a conservative, you know, like, and the sort of the fact that he feels rejected by both those kind of potential identity groups in some respects, and he goes on to basically do a lot of things which, you know, as he directly alludes to, should preclude him from any kind of high office. Certainly within the National Party, doesn't particularly like rugby, doesn't really know how to fish, and so on. And have you read the book? What did you and what is your take on how it fits into the generally bad genre that is New Zealand political memoir or writing?
I've read it. It is pretty good. And yeah, it's like surprisingly candid, and it'll be fascinating to see whether he's had pretty good media. Be fascinating to see whether he shows up in the preferred prime minister polling on the back of it. I genuinely don't know whether that will happen or not, because it is so unorthodox. And like, just to give listeners an example, he reveals this side of himself in that he likes carrying out pranks. And one of his pranks is that he takes photos of his wife when she's asleep to prove that she sleeps with her mouth open, and includes a photo of his wife asleep in the book. So, like, that's just quite strange. It's not, that doesn't seem like he's, playing 10-dimensional chess there in a way to maximize his political career. That's just genuinely quite an unusual thing for a politician to disclose. And so, yeah, I don't know how that book will play out in terms of his political career. I mean, I think he's definitely, if they're in government in, the foreseeable future, he'd have to be one of their top cabinet ministers, just because there's such a dearth of talent in that caucus at the moment that they would have to give him kind of a top slot in the corporation. But what does it mean in terms of his leadership? I don't know. And I kind of suspect that he doesn't really know either, that he was so constrained for such a long time and was playing a part for such a long time that he's just, and that didn't really work out for him, that he's just decided to kind of be who he really is and see where that takes his career.
It might be that, more politicians than we give them credit for actually are the sort of very trained and constrained animals that they present as, but the the Simon Bridges that comes through the pages of the book, the sort of neurotic, sort of both very driven but also kind of riven with sort of self-doubt or kind of an intense consciousness that his identity or his reality was very different from the archetype that he was supposed to be. It is quite attractive in both a New Zealand and a more narrow political sense. All right, well, I think that's basically all we've got. But thank you so much for coming on The Fold, Danyl.
Oh, thank you.
I love your writing, and strongly encourage our listeners to seek it out and to buy Tranquility and Ruin. It's a pretty extraordinary work.
Good lockdown book, I think.
Agree. There's a lot of lockdown in it.
Okay. Well, thanks, Duncan.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Cheers.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.